They said she was worthless, too big, too poor, too nothing. But on the night Clara Whitmore found a dying legend bleeding into the Colorado snow, she made a choice that would shatter everything this cruel mountain town believed about her. One coat, one stranger, one impossible decision that should have killed her. What happened next didn't just save a life. It ignited a reckoning that would burn through the valley like wildfire. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's journey travels. The cold came down like a fist that January evening, the kind of cold that turned breath to ice and made bones ache deep inside the marrow. Clara Whitmore pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her broad shoulders, but it did nothing. Nothing ever did. The wind off the high peaks cut straight through the worn wool like it wasn't even there, and her fingers had gone numb an hour ago, still clutching the small burlap sack of flour she'd earned after 10 brutal hours of washing other people's laundry in water so cold it cracked her knuckles open and made them bleed. 10 hours. One sack of flour. Not even coin. Flour because Mrs. Garrison at the boarding house said that's all she could spare for a girl Clara's size. And then she'd laugh that sharp little laugh that was supposed to sound like a joke, but never was. The other women had laughed too, their eyes sliding over Clara like she was some kind of unfortunate furniture, too large and awkward to be pretty, too poor to matter, too quiet to defend herself. Clara had learned a long time ago that defending herself only made it worse. The trail back to her cabin wound through 15 miles of high country, most of it exposed ridge where the wind howled straight down from the Continental Divide with nothing to stop it. Her cabin, if you could even call it that, sat at the ragged edge of the timberline, where the pine and spruce finally gave up trying to grow, and the land turned to nothing but rock and sky and endless, killing cold. It wasn't much. One room, gaps in the walls she'd stuffed with moss and mud, a roof that leaked when the snow got heavy, and a wood stove she'd traded 2 months of work for that barely kept the frost off the inside walls. But it was hers, the only thing in the world that was. She'd walked maybe 8 miles when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the trees or the distant cry of a hunting owl. A wet, rattling cough, thick with pain, and something worse, something final. Clara stopped, her boots crunching in the frozen snow. The sound came again, weaker this time, from somewhere down in the ravine that dropped away on the left side of the trail. Steep sides, thick with deadfall, and buried under 3 feet of fresh powder. Dark was coming on fast now, the last purple light bleeding out of the western sky, and the temperature was already dropping toward the kind of cold that killed. Every instinct she had told her to keep walking. It wasn't her business. Probably just an animal, wounded or dying. Maybe a deer that had broken a leg. Maybe a bear finding a place to hibernate. Either way, nothing she could do about it, and getting involved in other people's trouble had never done her a single bit of good. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to get home before full dark, get the stove lit, and survive another night. Clara stood there on the trail, the wind tearing at her coat and her empty stomach cramping with hunger, and listened to that cough rattle up from the darkness below. Then she heard the voice. "Help!" Barely a whisper, almost lost in the wind. A man's voice, rough and broken. "Please, somebody." Clara closed her eyes. Damn it all to hell. She looked down the steep slope, trying to gauge the drop, the distance, the danger. It had to be 30 feet down, maybe more, through deadfall and hidden rocks and snow that could be hiding anything. A cliff edge, a frozen creek, a drop that went deeper than she could see. Going down there in the dark was stupid. Going down there alone was suicidal. The voice came again, weaker, fading. "Please." Clara Whitmore set her precious sack of flour down on the trail, wedged it against a rock so it wouldn't roll away, and started down into the ravine. The descent was a nightmare. The snow was deep and unstable, hiding rocks and fallen logs that caught her feet and sent her sprawling more than once. Branches whipped at her face in the dark, and twice she slid 10 feet on her backside before catching herself on a tree trunk. Her coat snagged on something and tore with a sound like ripping paper, and she felt the cold rush in through the new hole like water through a breach in a dam. But she kept going, half sliding, half climbing down through the darkness, following that broken cough like a beacon. She found him at the bottom of the ravine, sprawled on his back in the snow near the frozen creek bed. Even in the dim twilight, she could see the blood. It was everywhere, soaked into the snow around him, dark and spreading, pooled beneath his left side where his heavy coat had been torn open by what looked like bullet holes. 3 of them, maybe 4, clustered tight below his ribs. His face was gray, lips blue, eyes half closed and glazed with shock and cold. But Clara knew that face. Everyone in Colorado Territory knew that face. Silas Boone. The name hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment she just stood there, staring down at him in disbelief. Silas Boone. The mountain legend himself. The man who'd scouted for the Army during the Indian campaigns, who'd guided wagon trains through the Rockies when everyone said it couldn't be done, who'd faced down grizzlies and outlaws and blizzards and lived to tell the tale. Stories about Silas Boone got told in every saloon and trading post from Denver to Santa Fe, how he'd tracked a band of horse thieves solo through 200 miles of winter wilderness and brought them back tied to their own saddles. How he'd survived 3 weeks in a snow cave with nothing but a knife and a handful of dried meat. How he'd stood his ground against 6 armed men in a canyon dispute and walked away without a scratch while they scattered like rabbits. And now here he was, bleeding out in the snow at the bottom of a ravine with the life draining out of him through bullet holes that someone had put there deliberately. This was an ambush, a murder. Boone? Clara dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his wounds, not sure where to start, what to do. Mr. Boone, can you hear me? His eyes rolled toward her, struggling to focus. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible, thick with pain and blood. They came out of the rocks. He coughed, and blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. Didn't see them until... Don't talk. Clara pressed her hand against the worst of the wounds, trying to stop the bleeding, but she could feel his blood pulsing hot against her palm, too much of it, too fast. His coat was already soaked through, and the cold was working against her. His body temperature was dropping by the minute, shock setting in hard. Save your strength. Shot my horse. His words were slurring now, consciousness starting to slip. Left me for dead. He probably should be dead already. The fact that he was still breathing was a testament to how damn tough he was. But tough only went so far against blood loss and hypothermia. He needed a doctor. He needed warmth, real medical attention, proper supplies. He needed things Clara didn't have and couldn't get. Not out here, not in time. The nearest town with a real doctor was Timber Ridge, 12 miles east. Even if she could somehow get Boone up that ravine slope and back to the trail, even if she could flag down a rider willing to help, and that was a big if this time of night, it would take hours to get a doctor out here. Hours Silas Boone didn't have. Her cabin was only 7 miles north, straight up the trail. No doctor there, no medicine, barely any supplies. But it had walls, a roof, a stove. It was shelter. And right now, shelter might be the only thing keeping this man from dying in the next hour. Clara looked up at the darkening sky, then back down at Silas Boone's gray face. She was a big woman. People never let her forget it. But he was bigger. Probably outweighed her by 50 pounds. All of it muscle and bone and dead weight. Getting him up that slope would be brutal. Getting him 7 miles up the trail in the dark would be impossible. But leaving him here was murder. She made her decision in the space of a single heartbeat, the way all the worst and best decisions of her life had been made, quickly, before the fear could talk her out of it. I'm going to move you, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. It's going to hurt like hell, Mr. Boone, but I need you to hold on for me. Can you do that? His eyes found hers again, and for just a moment they sharpened, focusing with an effort that she could see cost him. He gave a single, tiny nod. Good. Clara shrugged out of her coat, the only warm coat she owned, the one she'd spent 3 months' wages on last fall, because she knew she wouldn't survive another winter without it, and wrapped it around him as carefully as she could, tucking it over his wounds, trying to keep pressure on them while also keeping him warm. The cold hit her immediately, vicious and sharp, but she pushed it aside. She'd been cold before. She'd survived worse. That was a lie, and she knew it, but she told it to herself anyway. Getting Boone up the ravine nearly killed them both. Clara rigged a makeshift drag using fallen branches and his own belt, managed to roll him onto it despite his gasps of pain, and then started hauling. 30 feet of steep, snow-covered slope in pitch darkness with a 200-pound unconscious man strapped to tree branches. She slipped and fell a dozen times, lost her grip twice, and had to scramble to catch him before he slid back down, tore open both palms on rough bark until they bled, and spent what felt like hours clawing her way upward one brutal foot at a time. When she finally dragged him over the lip of the ravine and back onto the trail, she collapsed beside him, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and cold. For a long moment, she just lay there in the snow, gasping, wondering if she'd just made the worst mistake of her life. Then Silas Boone coughed again, wet and rattling, and Clara pushed herself back to her feet. 7 miles. In the dark. With a dying man. She bent down, grabbed the drag handles, and started walking. The next 3 hours existed in a kind of timeless hell that Clara would never be able to fully remember later. There was only the endless white trail stretching out before her, the crushing weight of the drag pulling at her shoulders and back, and the cold working its way deeper into her bones with every step. She couldn't feel her hands anymore, couldn't feel her feet. Her face had gone numb, and ice had formed in her hair and eyelashes. Every breath burned in her chest like she was inhaling broken glass. But she kept walking. Twice she had to stop and check to make sure Boone was still breathing, her own hands so numb she could barely feel for a pulse. Both times she found it, faint and thready, but still there, still fighting. The second time his eyes fluttered open for just a moment. "Should have left me," he whispered. "Shut up," Clara told him, and kept walking. The lights of her cabin appeared like a miracle out of the darkness sometime after midnight, a single dim glow from the window that meant the embers in her stove hadn't died completely. Clara felt something break loose in her chest at the sight. Relief, maybe. Or just the last of her strength giving out. And she stumbled the final 100 yards to her door, dragging Silas Boone behind her. Getting him inside and onto her bed took the last reserves of energy she had. She managed it somehow, stripped off his blood-soaked coat and shirt with shaking hands, and then just stood there staring at the wounds in the lamplight, trying to remember everything she'd ever heard about treating gunshot injuries. It wasn't much. She'd seen men injured before, mining accidents, logging mishaps, the occasional fight that got out of hand, but never anything like this. Never bullet holes. Never this much blood. But she had needles. She had thread. She had whiskey for sterilization, cheap stuff she kept for trade, and she had a fire she could build up hot enough to boil water. It would have to be enough. Clara fed more wood into the stove with hands that could barely grip, put water on to boil, and threaded her needle by lamplight. Then she sat down beside Silas Boone, took a breath, and started stitching. He woke up screaming when the needle went in. His whole body arched off the bed, his hands coming up to grab her wrist with shocking strength, his eyes wild and unfocused. "Hold still." Clara pinned his arm down with her elbow, her voice hard. "I know it hurts, but if I don't close these wounds, you're going to bleed to death. Do you understand me?" For a moment she thought he was too far gone to hear her, lost in shock and pain. Then his eyes found her face, and something in them cleared. He gave a tight nod, his jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscles jumping in his neck, and forced himself still. Clara went back to work. She'd sewn up torn fabric 1,000 times. Patching clothes was how she kept herself decent when she couldn't afford new. But sewing human flesh was different. The needle pulled through skin that was cold and gray, and the wounds were ragged, torn, nothing like the neat cuts she'd imagined. She had to work by feel as much as sight, pulling the edges together as best she could, trying to remember to space the stitches evenly, to not pull too tight or too loose. Boone didn't scream again, but she could hear his breathing, fast and shallow, each exhale a controlled hiss through clenched teeth. Sweat broke out on his forehead despite the cold, and twice his eyes rolled back and she thought she'd lost him. But each time he dragged himself back from the edge through sheer force of will. It took her 2 hours to close all 4 wounds. When she was done, her hands were cramping and covered in his blood. Her back ached from bending over the bed, and she felt hollowed out, emptied of everything except a bone-deep exhaustion that made her limbs feel like lead. But the bleeding had stopped. The wounds were closed, It was crude work. Any real doctor would have done better, but it was done. Clara covered him with every blanket she owned, built the fire up as high as she dared, and then realized she had a new problem. She had no food left to give him. The flour she'd earned that day was still sitting on the trail, 7 miles back, where she'd left it when she'd gone down into that ravine. Everything else in her cabin, a handful of dried beans, a few wrinkled potatoes, some salt, she'd already eaten or traded away. She'd been planning to make bread with that flour, to stretch it out over the next week with careful rationing. Now it was gone, abandoned in the snow, and she had nothing. Clara sat down on the floor beside the bed, her back against the wall, and laughed. It was either laugh or cry, and crying never solved anything. She'd just saved the life of the most famous frontiersman in Colorado territory. She'd hauled him 7 miles through a blizzard, stitched his wounds with her own hands, given him her only coat and every blanket she owned, and now she was going to starve to death in her own cabin while he recovered. The absurdity of it was almost beautiful. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin and finding every gap in the walls. Clara pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and watched Silas Boone breathe. His face was still gray, his lips still blue, but his chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. He was alive. For now, that would have to be enough. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion, cold, and hunger that made Clara question whether saving Boone had been an act of courage or just the final stupid mistake of a woman who'd never had the sense to protect herself first. She burned through her firewood at an alarming rate, keeping the cabin warm enough to stave off hypothermia. Every few hours she checked Boone's wounds, cleaned them with precious whiskey, watched for signs of infection. She boiled snow for water and got him to drink, a few sips at a time, supporting his head when he was too weak to lift it himself. And she starved. By the second day, her stomach had stopped growling and started cramping instead, sharp pains that doubled her over. She ignored them. By the third day, she was lightheaded, her hands shaking with more than just cold, her vision going gray at the edges when she stood up too fast. She still had those few potatoes and the dried beans. She could have cooked them, eaten them, eased the worst of the hunger. But Boone would need them when he woke up, if he woke up, and there wasn't enough for both of them. So Clara made her choice, the same choice she'd been making since that night on the trail. He lives, whatever it costs. On the morning of the 4th day, someone knocked on her door. Clara jerked awake from where she'd been dozing on the floor, her heart hammering. No one ever came out here. No one even knew where she lived, except maybe Mrs. Garrison, and that woman wouldn't cross the street to help Clara, much less ride 15 miles into the high country. The knock came again, harder this time, impatient. Clara dragged herself to her feet, swaying, and opened the door a crack. 3 boys stood on her doorstep, teenagers from town, the kind who had nothing better to do than make other people's lives miserable. She recognized them, Tommy Brewster, the blacksmith's son, and his 2 friends whose names she'd never bothered to learn. They were all smirking, that particular expression boys got when they were about to say something cruel, and thought it was funny. "Well, well," Tommy said, his eyes sliding past her to peer into the cabin. "Heard you been holed up out here for days, Clara. People are starting to talk." Clara kept the door mostly closed, blocking their view. "What do you want?" "Want?" Tommy grinned. "Just being neighborly. Came to check on you, make sure you ain't frozen solid, though I guess you got plenty of insulation, don't you? Must be nice, being built like a—" "Get off my property!" Clara's voice was flat, drained of everything except exhaustion. The boys laughed. One of them, the tall one with the bad teeth, leaned to the side, trying to see around her. "You got somebody in there, Clara? That why you been hiding? You finally find some poor bastard desperate enough to—" Clara slammed the door in their faces. She heard them laughing outside, heard Tommy shout something about fat whores, and mountain pigs, heard their boots crunching away through the snow. Then silence. Clara leaned her forehead against the door and closed her eyes. 4 years she'd lived in this valley. 4 years of washing clothes and hauling water and taking whatever scraps of work people would give her, and this was all she'd earned. Mockery, insults, and 3 boys who rode 15 miles just to remind her that she didn't matter. Behind her, Silas Boone coughed. Clara turned. He was awake, truly awake this time, his eyes open and clear, watching her from the bed. His face was still pale, But the gray cast was gone, replaced by something closer to living color. How long? His voice was rough, barely more than a rasp. 4 days, Clara said. She didn't move from the door, suddenly aware of how she must look, filthy, hollow-eyed, shaking with hunger and cold. You were shot, ambushed on the trail, do you remember? Boone's eyes went distant for a moment, then sharpened. Yeah, I remember. He tried to sit up, gasped, and fell back against the pillow. His hand went to his side, found the bandages. Who? I stitched you up. Clara crossed to the stove, poured water from the pot into a tin cup, brought it to him. Wasn't pretty, but it held. He took the cup with a hand that shook, drank, his eyes never leaving her face. You brought me here. Didn't have much choice. You were dying. You had a choice. Boone set the cup down carefully, his gaze steady and far too knowing. Could have left me in that ravine. Should have, probably. Safer that way. Clara didn't answer. What was there to say? Yes, I should have left you to die, but I'm too stupid to know when to protect myself? Boone was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving around the cabin, taking in the bare walls, the gaps stuffed with moss, the dwindling stack of firewood, the empty shelves. When he looked back at her, his expression had changed. Something harder in it now, something that looked almost like anger. How much food do you have? Enough, Clara lied. How much? She met his eyes, saw that he already knew, and gave up. Some beans. A few potatoes. That's it? His voice went flat. That's all you got, and you've been feeding me your water, keeping me warm with your firewood, giving me... He stopped, his jaw clenching. Where's your coat? Clara looked away. You needed it more. Jesus Christ. Boone closed his eyes, and for a moment she thought he might pass out again. But when he opened them, they were fierce, burning with something she couldn't name. How many days since you ate? I'm fine. How many days? 3. The word came out before she could stop it. Maybe 4. I lose track. The silence that followed was crushing. Clara felt her face burn with shame, not because she was starving, but because he knew. Because this man, this legend, was lying in her bed seeing exactly how pathetic her life really was. Seeing the poverty, the isolation, the desperation that had brought her to this point. Those boys, Boone said quietly, the ones at your door, they always talk to you like that? Clara's hands clenched into fists. Doesn't matter. It matters. No, she said, her voice harder than she intended. It doesn't. That's just how people are, how they've always been. I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be. Something in Clara's chest twisted at those words, at the simple, honest anger in them. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that someone, anyone, thought the way people treated her was wrong. But belief was a luxury she couldn't afford, and hope had let her down too many times before. You should rest, she said, turning away. I'll make you something to eat when you're stronger. Clara. The way he said her name, like it mattered, like she mattered, stopped her cold. Thank you. Boone's voice was quiet but absolute. For my life. For what you gave up to save it. I won't forget. Clara nodded without turning around, not trusting her voice, and went back to her post by the stove. Outside, the wind howled and the winter closed in tighter. Over the next 2 days, Silas Boone grew stronger while Clara grew weaker. It was a slow exchange, invisible at first, like watching sand slip through an hourglass, one grain at a time. She cooked the last of the potatoes in a thin broth, gave him the larger portion, and told herself the small bowl she kept was enough. It wasn't. She felt her body consuming itself, burning through reserves she didn't have, her clothes hanging looser on her frame each morning. But Boone was sitting up now, breathing easier, the color returning to his face. That had to count for something. On the 6th day, she woke to find him standing, actually standing, by the window, one hand braced against the wall for support, looking out at the snow-covered peaks. The effort clearly cost him, his breathing labored, fresh blood seeping through the bandages at his side, but he was upright. You shouldn't be out of bed, Clara said from the floor where she'd been sleeping, her voice hoarse. Needed to see. Boone didn't turn around. Needed to know if they were still out there. Who? But Clara already knew the answer. The men who shot me. He finally looked at her, and his expression was grim. They think I'm dead. Left me for the scavengers. But if they find out I survived, if they find out I'm here—" He trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the cold air. Clara pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly. "Why did they ambush you?" Boone was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. "There's a land dispute. Rich man named Calloway from back east bought up mineral rights to half the valley. Problem is, some of those claims overlap with homesteads that have been there 20 years. People who worked that land, built lives on it. Calloway wants them gone." "And you got involved?" "I was guiding a survey team, making sure the boundary lines were drawn honest. Calloway didn't like what we found. Turns out most of his claims don't hold legal water. So he decided to solve the problem a different way." Boone's hand went to his side, pressing against the wounds. 6 men, all carrying new rifles. Professional killers, not local boys. They knew exactly where I'd be on that trail. Clara felt ice slide down her spine. "If they find you here, they'll kill you too." Boone's voice was flat, stating facts. "Can't leave witnesses. That's how men like Calloway operate." The words settled between them like stones dropping into deep water. Clara walked to the window, looked out at the endless white expanse, the timber ridge in the distance, the single narrow trail that led back toward civilization. Anyone coming up that trail would be visible for miles. No way to hide. No way to run. "How long before you can ride?" she asked. "Week, maybe, if the wounds don't go bad." Boone studied her face, his eyes too sharp, seeing too much. "You're scared." "I'm always scared." The admission came out before Clara could stop it, raw and honest. "That's just living. Not like this. This is different." He was right, of course. The everyday fear of hunger and cold and mockery was one thing. She'd learned to carry that weight the way she carried water from the creek, just another burden that never got lighter. But this was different. This was men with guns, professionals who killed for money, and the knowledge that she'd put herself directly in their path by saving a man they wanted dead. "I made my choice," Clara said quietly. "Not taking it back now." Boone watched her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "You got more spine than most men I've known." "Spine doesn't stop bullets." "No," he agreed. "But it's worth something anyway." Clara turned away from the window, suddenly exhausted by the conversation, by the constant weight of fear, by everything. "You should rest. Save your strength." "Clara." His voice stopped her at the stove. "When I get out of here, when this is over, I'm going to make this right. What you did for me, what you gave up. I don't forget debts." "I don't want your charity." "It's not charity. It's honor." Boone lowered himself back onto the bed with a grimace, his face going pale from the effort. "There's a difference." Clara didn't answer. In her experience, honor was just another word people used to make themselves feel better about their choices. It didn't put food on the table or keep the cold out, but she didn't have the energy to argue, so she nodded and went back to rationing their dwindling supplies. That night, the visitors came back. Clara woke to the sound of horses outside, multiple riders, their voices carrying through the thin cabin walls. Her heart kicked into a gallop, and she was on her feet instantly, moving to the window. 4 men this time, not boys, hard-looking men in heavy coats, rifles across their saddles, their breath steaming in the freezing air. They weren't from town. She'd never seen any of them before. Beside her, Boone was already awake, his hand reaching for a gun he didn't have. "Calloway's men?" "I don't know." Claire's voice was barely a whisper. "But they're not here by accident." One of the men dismounted, walked toward the cabin. He was tall, lean, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that were flat and cold even from a distance. When he knocked on the door, it wasn't a request. It was a demand. Clara looked at Boone. He jerked his head toward the small storage space behind the stove, barely big enough for a man if he curled up tight. She understood immediately. Hide. She helped him into the cramped space, ignoring his sharp intake of breath as the movement pulled at his wounds, then shoved some firewood in front to block the view. The knock came again, harder, impatient. Clara wiped her sweating palms on her skirt, took a breath, and opened the door. The tall man looked her up and down with the kind of assessment that made her skin crawl. "Evening, ma'am. Sorry to disturb you at this hour." He didn't sound sorry at all. What do you want? Clara kept her voice steady, kept her body blocking the doorway. Looking for someone. Mountain man named Silas Boone. You seen him? Clara's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it, but she forced her face to stay blank. No. No? The man's eyes narrowed. You sure about that? Because we got word he might have come through this area about a week back. Thought maybe he stopped here, being as this is the only cabin for miles. I haven't seen anyone. Clara met his gaze, held it. Been snowed in for weeks. The man studied her face, looking for tells, for cracks in the lie. Clara stared back, drawing on every ounce of stubborn will she'd built up over years of being dismissed, overlooked, underestimated. People like him never really saw people like her anyway. She was just another poor woman, too fat, too plain, too nothing to matter. Finally he grunted. Mind if we take a look inside, just to be sure? Yes, I do mind. Clara's voice went hard. This is my home. You got no right. Now, ma'am, we don't want any trouble. Then get off my property. For a moment she thought he might push it, might force his way in anyway. His hand moved toward his rifle, and Clara felt time slow down, felt her whole world balance on the edge of a knife. Then one of the other men called out from his horse. Tracker says his blood trail ended at the ravine, Cole. Probably bled out and got covered by the snow. We're wasting time here. The tall man, Cole, gave Clara one last hard look, then stepped back. You see, Boone? You let us know. Calloway's offering a reward for information. $500. $500. A fortune. More money than Clara would see in 5 years of washing clothes and hauling water. I'll remember that, she said, and closed the door in his face. She stood there, not moving, barely breathing, listening to them mount up and ride away. It took 15 minutes before the sound of hooves faded completely. Only then did she let herself shake, let the terror she'd been holding back flood through her system. They're gone, she whispered. Boone emerged from behind the stove, his face gray with pain but his eyes fierce. You lied for me. Of course I did. They would have killed you if they knew. I know. Clara sank down onto the floor, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. I know. $500, Boone said quietly. You could have turned me in. Could have taken that money and gotten out of here, started fresh somewhere else. Clara looked at him, this legendary frontiersman she'd saved, this stranger who'd brought death to her doorstep. I don't sell people. Not for $500. Not for $5,000. Something changed in Boone's expression then, something deep and permanent, like a door opening that could never be closed again. He crossed to where she sat, lowered himself down beside her with visible effort, and when he spoke his voice was rough with emotion. I swear to you, Clara Whitmore, on everything I've got left. When I get out of this, I'm going to make them pay, all of them. Calloway, his hired guns, every person in that town who treated you like you were nothing. He paused, his jaw clenched. And I'm going to make sure you never have to live like this again. Big promises, Clara said, but her voice cracked. Not promises, facts. Boone met her eyes. You saved my life when no one else would have. You lied to killers to protect me. You're starving yourself to keep me fed. That means something. That means everything. Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that her choices mattered, that her life could be different, that someone finally saw her as more than just the fat girl nobody wanted. But belief required hope, and hope required strength she didn't have anymore. You should rest, she said instead, pulling away. They might come back. They didn't sleep that night. Clara sat by the window with Boone's knife, the only weapon they had, watching the trail while Boone recovered his strength in silence. The hours crawled by, dark and cold and heavy with the weight of what could have happened, what still might happen. By morning, the last of their food was gone. Clara stared at the empty pot, the bare shelves, and felt something inside her finally break. Not dramatically. There were no tears, no collapse. Just a quiet fracture, like ice cracking under weight it could no longer bear. She'd given everything she had. Her coat, her food, her safety, her warmth. And now there was nothing left to give. I need to go to town, she said. Boone looked up sharply from the bed. It's not safe. It's not safe here either. We have no food. The firewood's almost gone. If I don't get supplies. She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Those men could still be around. Then I'll be careful. Clara pulled on her threadbare shawl, the only outer garment she had left since she'd given Boone her coat. It wouldn't be enough in the cold, but it was better than nothing. I'll take the back trails, avoid the main road. Be back before dark. Clara, you can't stop me, Boone. You can barely stand. She looked at him, saw the frustration and helplessness warring in his expression, and felt something soften. I'll be careful. I promise. The ride to town took 4 hours through snow-choked back trails that barely qualified as paths. Clara had borrowed a horse from the widow Henderson 2 ridges over, a favor that had cost her a promise to do washing for free when she got back. And the old mare picked her way through the drifts with the patient resignation of an animal that had seen too many hard winters. By the time Clara reached the outskirts of Timber Ridge, she was shaking with cold, her fingers numb, and her face burning with windburn. The town looked the same as always, a struggling collection of buildings clustered around the main street, half of them empty, the rest housing people who were either too stubborn or too poor to leave. Smoke rose from chimneys, horses stood tied at hitching posts, and through the windows of the saloon she could see men drinking their pay before they remembered they had families to feed. Clara stopped at the general store, the same one where Mrs. Garrison bought her supplies. The owner, a sour-faced man named Pritchard, looked up from his ledger when she walked in, his eyes going flat with recognition. Clara. Not a greeting, just acknowledgement that she existed. What do you want? Flour, beans, salt pork if you have it. Clara's voice was steady despite the humiliation that always came with begging for credit. I can pay you back when... No credit. Pritchard didn't even look up. Cash only. I don't have cash, but I'll work it off, I'll wash clothes, I said no credit. Now he did look at her, his expression hard. You already owe me for that flour you took 3 months back. Until that's paid, you don't get nothing. Clara felt her face burn. That flour had been the agreed payment for 2 weeks of washing, not credit. But arguing with Pritchard was like arguing with a wall, pointless and exhausting. Please, she heard herself say, hating the word, hating the weakness in it. I just need a little to get through. You deaf girl? Pritchard's voice rose, loud enough that other customers turned to look. I said no. Now get out of my store before I have you thrown out. The shame hit Clara like a physical blow, hot and suffocating. She turned to go, her vision blurring, and nearly collided with Mrs. Garrison in the doorway. Oh, the older woman said, stepping back dramatically like Clara might contaminate her by proximity. Clara, I heard you'd been indisposed. The way she said it, loaded with insinuation, made Clara's stomach turn. I've been busy. I'm sure you have. Mrs. Garrison's eyes traveled over Clara's thin shawl, her wind-burned face, the desperate exhaustion that must have been written in every line of her body. Actually, I'm glad I ran into you. I need to talk to you about your situation. My situation? The room, behind the boarding house. Mrs. Garrison's smile was thin and sharp. I'm afraid I'm going to need it back. Clara stared at her. That room, barely more than a shed, really, with a dirt floor and walls that let in the wind, was where she'd stored her washing equipment, the few tools of her trade. But you said I could use it as long as I needed. That was before. Mrs. Garrison lowered her voice, stepping closer in a parody of confidence. People are talking, Clara, saying you've been hiding out in that cabin of yours, consorting with, well, with unsuitable company. I run a respectable establishment. I can't have that kind of association. Unsuitable company? Clara's voice came out flat, distant, like she was hearing someone else speak. What are you talking about? Those boys who rode out to check on you, they said they heard a man's voice inside. And then Calloway's men came through asking questions about Silas Boone and, well... Mrs. Garrison shrugged, the gesture almost apologetic, but not quite. You understand? I can't risk my reputation on rumors. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. The boys had spread their story, twisted it into something dirty. The town had taken that seed and grown it into a full scandal, and now Clara was being punished for the crime of helping a dying man. "There's no one," Clara started, then stopped. What was the point? They'd already decided what to believe. "When do I need to clear out?" "End of the week should be fine." Mrs. Garrison patted Clara's arm with false sympathy. "I'm sure you understand. It's nothing personal." It was entirely personal, but Clara didn't have the energy to say so. She just nodded and walked out into the street, into the cold, into the endless weight of a world that had decided long ago that she didn't deserve kindness. She was halfway to the edge of town, leading the widow's horse and trying to figure out how she was going to survive the next week, with no food, no work, and no place to store her equipment, when she heard the laughter. It was coming from outside the saloon, the same three boys from before, Tommy Brewster and his friends, along with a few others she didn't recognize. They were passing around a bottle, loud and reckless the way young men got when they were trying to impress each other. Clara tried to walk past quickly, keeping her head down, but Tommy spotted her. "Well, well, if it ain't the mountain whore herself!" His voice carried down the street, drawing attention. "Come to show us your man, Clara, or is he too busy enjoying all that?" Clara kept walking. "Don't engage, don't react, just get to the horse and go." But Tommy wasn't done. He stepped into her path, swaying slightly, his friends clustering behind him. "I'm talking to you, pig. It's rude to ignore people." "Move," Clara said quietly. "Make me." Tommy grinned, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Or maybe your mystery man will come do it for you." "Oh, wait. He doesn't exist, does he? Because who'd want to touch something like you?" The other boys laughed, the sound ugly and mean, and something in Clara finally snapped. Not the quiet fracture from before. This was louder, sharper, a break that came with heat and fury and 4 years of swallowed rage. She looked Tommy Brewster in the eye and said very clearly, "Get out of my way before I put you on the ground." The laughter died. Tommy blinked, surprised, then his face flushed with anger. "You threatening me?" "I'm stating facts." Clara took a step forward, and she must have looked different somehow. Must have carried some of the desperation and fear and absolute exhaustion that had been building for weeks, because Tommy actually stepped back. "I am tired, I am hungry, and I am done being your entertainment. Move, now." For a second she thought it might actually work. Then one of Tommy's friends, the tall one with bad teeth, laughed nervously and said, "She's bluffing. Fat cow can't do nothing." Tommy's courage came back, bolstered by his audience. He reached out to shove Clara's shoulder, his hand already moving. Clara caught his wrist, twisted hard, and used his own momentum to send him sprawling face first into the frozen mud of the street. The silence that followed was absolute. Tommy lay there for a moment, stunned, then pushed himself up with mud on his face and murder in his eyes. "You bitch! That's enough!" The new voice cut through the tension like a knife, and everyone turned. A man stood in the saloon doorway, older, maybe 50, with iron gray hair and a sheriff's badge pinned to his coat. Clara didn't know him. The last sheriff had left town 2 years ago, and she hadn't heard about a replacement. The sheriff walked down the steps slowly, his eyes moving from Tommy to Clara and back again. "You boys causing trouble?" "She attacked me." Tommy was on his feet now, pointing at Clara. "You saw it, Sheriff Dawson. I saw you try to put hands on a woman and get what you deserved for it." Dawson's voice was mild, but there was steel underneath. "Now you can either apologize and go sleep it off, or you can spend the night in my jail explaining to your father why I had to lock you up. Your choice." Tommy's face went through several shades of red, but he wasn't stupid enough to argue with the law. He muttered something that might have been an apology, then stalked off with his friends trailing behind, throwing dark looks over their shoulders. Dawson waited until they were gone, then turned to Clara. "You all right, miss?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Her hands were shaking, reaction setting in now that the danger had passed. "Name's Marcus Dawson. Just started as sheriff 3 weeks ago." He studied her face, taking in the exhaustion, the hunger, the desperation she couldn't quite hide. "You look like you could use a hot meal and a safe place to sit for a spell." "I'm fine," Clara said automatically. "That wasn't really a question." Dawson gestured toward the small building that served as the sheriff's office. Come on, I got coffee on the stove and some stew that's actually edible. You can tell me what those boys were really on about while you eat." Clara wanted to refuse, wanted to get on the horse and ride back to her cabin and Boone and the relative safety of isolation. But the mention of food made her stomach clench with hunger so sharp it was painful, and her legs were shaking too hard to ride anyway. "Just for a minute," she heard herself say. Dawson's office was small but warm, with a stove in the corner and the promised pot of stew bubbling on top. He ladled out a bowl without asking, set it in front of Clara with a hunk of bread, and poured 2 cups of coffee while she tried not to fall on the food like a starving animal. She managed to eat slowly, with some dignity, though it took every ounce of self-control she had. The stew was simple, beef and potatoes and carrots, but it was the first real food she'd had in days, and she felt strength flowing back into her body with each bite. Dawson watched her eat in silence, his own coffee untouched, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he said, "Those boys mentioned Silas Boone. Said Calloway's men are looking for him." Clara's hand tightened on her spoon. "So?" "So Calloway's men came through here asking questions about a week ago. Said Boone was dead, but they wanted to make sure. Seemed real interested in whether anyone had seen him." Dawson paused. "They also asked about you." Clara set down her spoon carefully. "Why would they ask about me?" "Because you live alone in the high country, and your cabin's on the trail where Boone disappeared. Makes you a person of interest." Dawson leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. "They wanted to know if you'd been in town recently, if you'd bought any unusual supplies, if anyone had seen you with injuries or blood on your clothes. I told them I'd just arrived and didn't know you, but they'll be back." The implication settled between them like a stone in still water. Clara met Dawson's gaze, trying to read what he wanted, what he knew, what he planned to do with the information. "I don't know anything about Silas Boone," she said carefully. "Didn't say you did." Dawson picked up his coffee, took a sip. "But if you did, if someone was hiding him, protecting him from men who wanted him dead, that person would be in considerable danger, the kind of danger that could get them killed. Then it's a good thing I don't know anything." Dawson studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Right, good thing." He stood, walked to a cabinet, and pulled out a small sack of supplies, flour, dried beans, salt pork, the exact things Clara had tried to buy from Pritchard. He set them on the table in front of her. "Consider this a welcome from the new sheriff. No charge." Clara stared at the supplies, then at Dawson. "Why?" "Because those boys were wrong about you. Because Pritchard's a thief who's been overcharging folks for years, and I'm going to enjoy auditing his books. And because—" He hesitated, then said quietly, "because if Silas Boone is alive somewhere, hiding from Calloway's killers, the person keeping him safe deserves better than what this town's given them." Clara's throat tightened. "You don't know—" "I don't know anything," Dawson agreed, "and I don't need to. But when Calloway's men come back, and they will, you make sure to stay out of sight. Don't give them another chance to find you, understand?" Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She left town 20 minutes later with the supplies secured to the widow's horse, her stomach full for the first time in a week, and the strange feeling that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in the world had given up on her. The ride back took longer than the trip down, the horse moving slower under the added weight, but Clara didn't mind. She had time to think, to process everything that had happened. Tommy Brewster's humiliation, Mrs. Garrison's betrayal, Dawson's unexpected kindness. The pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite see the shape of yet. When she finally reached her cabin, the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of gold and crimson. She saw smoke coming from the chimney. Boone must have built up the fire, and the sight of it made something warm unfold in her chest. Not quite hope, but something close. She was stabling the widow's horse in the small lean-to when she heard it, hoofbeats, coming up the trail fast. Multiple riders, pushing hard. Clara's blood turned to ice. She grabbed the supplies and ran for the cabin, hitting the door hard enough to make it slam open. Boone was on his feet instantly, his face alert despite the pain it clearly caused him. "Riders!" Clara gasped. "Coming fast, maybe 5 minutes out." Boone swore, moved to the window, his hands clenched into fists. "They must have followed you from town." "No, I was careful. I watched." "Doesn't matter now." Boone turned to face her, and his expression was hard as stone. Clara, listen to me. When they get here, you tell them I forced you. Tell them I threatened you, made you hide me. Tell them whatever you need to tell them to stay alive. I'm not— Yes, you are. He crossed to her, grabbed her shoulders. This isn't your fight. You've done enough. More than enough. Now you save yourself. The hoofbeats were getting closer. Clara could hear shouting now, harsh voices carrying through the cold air. She looked at Boone, at this man she'd saved, this legend she'd protected, and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her again. Then she made her decision, the same one she'd been making all along. No, Clara said quietly. She moved to the door, positioned herself in front of it. This is my home, my choice, and I'm not letting them take you without a fight. Boone stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had, but Clara had spent her whole life being pushed around, dismissed, treated like she didn't matter. She'd given up her coat, her food, her safety for this man. She'd lied to killers and faced down the whole damn town. She wasn't stopping now. The riders reached the cabin and surrounded it, their horses stamping and blowing in the cold. Clara heard the creak of leather as men dismounted, heard the metallic click of rifles being readied. Through the window, she could see them clearly now. 6 men, all armed, all professional, Calloway's killers. The tall one, Cole, stepped forward and hammered on the door. We know he's in there. His voice was hard, final. We tracked blood from town, fresh blood, leading right to this cabin. So you got one chance to make this easy. Send Boone out, and maybe you live. Maybe. Clara looked at Boone one last time. He was standing now, weaponless but defiant, ready to face whatever came next. Their eyes met, and in that moment something passed between them. Understanding, respect, recognition of what they'd both given up to get here. Then Clara opened the door and stepped outside to face the killers alone. The cold hit Clara like a wall when she stepped outside, but she barely felt it. Her focus narrowed to the 6 men standing in a semicircle around her cabin, their rifles catching the dying light, their faces hard with the kind of certainty that came from being paid to kill and knowing no one would stop them. Cole stood at the center, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. His eyes moved over Clara with the same cold assessment as before, but this time there was something else in them, satisfaction, like a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. Step aside, he said. Not a request. No. Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. She planted her feet, made herself immovable. This is my property. You have no right to be here. Cole's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. We got every right. We're acting on behalf of Mr. Calloway, who has legitimate business interests in this territory. Silas Boone interfered with those interests, and now he's going to answer for it. There's no one here but me. That's a lie. Cole took a step forward, and the other men shifted, tightening the circle. We followed blood from town, fresh blood, still wet in the snow. Someone rode that horse bleeding, and we both know it wasn't you. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she kept her face blank. I cut my hand on a fence post loading supplies. That's all you tracked. Show me. For a moment, Clara's mind went blank with panic. Then she remembered. She had cut her hands days ago, hauling Boone up that ravine. The wounds had mostly healed, but there were still scabs, still marks. She held out her palms, letting Cole see the torn skin across both. Cole studied her hands, his jaw tightening with frustration. But before he could speak, one of the other men, a shorter, stockier killer with a scarred face, stepped forward and pointed at the cabin. There's smoke from 2 fires in there. I can see it from here. She's keeping a bigger fire than one person needs. It's cold, Claire said flatly. I keep warm however I can. Let us search the cabin, Cole said. If you're telling the truth, you got nothing to hide. I said no. Cole's patience snapped. He moved fast, grabbing Clara's arm and trying to shove her aside. But Clara was bigger than he expected, heavier, and she'd spent years hauling water and washing clothes and surviving through sheer stubborn strength. She set her weight and didn't budge. I said no, she repeated, louder this time. Cole's hand went to his gun. Last chance, woman. Move or— The cabin door slammed open behind Clara, and Silas Boone stepped out into the dying light. He looked like death warmed over, pale, shaking, one hand pressed to his bandaged side where fresh blood was seeping through. But he was standing upright, and in his free hand he held Clara's kitchen knife, the only weapon they had. It was pathetic compared to 6 rifles, and everyone there knew it, but Boone's eyes were clear and hard as flint, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of a man who'd survived everything the mountains could throw at him and refused to die quietly. "You want me, Cole? Here I am. Let the woman go." Cole released Clara's arm, his attention shifting entirely to Boone. A slow smile spread across his face. "Silas Boone, heard you were dead." "Heard wrong." "Not for long." Cole gestured, and his men spread out, rifles rising. "Mr. Calloway wants you gone. Says you're bad for business. Says you cost him a lot of money with your honest survey work." "Calloway's claims are fraudulent," Boone said. "Every homesteader in that valley has legal right to their land. He's trying to steal what doesn't belong to him." "That's not how Mr. Calloway sees it. And since he's the one with money and lawyers and men like us," Cole's hand moved to his gun. "His version of the story is the one that's going to stick." Clara watched this exchange with growing horror, her mind racing through options and finding nothing. 6 armed men, 1 wounded frontiersman with a kitchen knife, no help for miles, no way to fight, no way to run. Then she heard it, distant at first, but growing closer. More hoofbeats, multiple riders coming hard up the trail from the opposite direction. Cole heard it too. His head snapped around, his expression shifting from confidence to uncertainty. "Who?" The riders burst into view around the bend in the trail, and Clara's breath caught. There were at least 20 of them, maybe more, all mounted on strong horses and carrying rifles across their saddles. They rode with military precision, spreading out to flank Calloway's men, cutting off any escape route. At their head rode Sheriff Marcus Dawson, his face grim and his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. He pulled his horse to a stop 20 feet from Cole, his hand resting on his own rifle. Behind him, his men did the same, a wall of armed authority that outnumbered Calloway's killers 3-1. "Evening, gentlemen," Dawson said, his voice carrying across the frozen clearing. "You boys are a long way from town." Cole's face had gone rigid, calculating odds that were no longer in his favor. "This is private business, Sheriff. Doesn't concern you." "See, that's where you're wrong." Dawson dismounted slowly, never taking his eyes off Cole. "When armed men ride into my territory making threats against my citizens, that becomes my business real quick. So why don't you explain what you're doing here, pointing guns at Miss Whitmore and a wounded man?" "We're acting on behalf of Calloway." "Yeah, I heard that part already." Dawson spat into the snow. "Problem is, Calloway doesn't have legal authority in this county. I do. And unless you got a warrant signed by a judge, you're just a bunch of armed thugs committing assault and trespassing." Cole's hand twitched toward his gun, and every rifle behind Dawson snapped into position. The sound of 20 hammers cocking simultaneously was like thunder in the stillness. "I wouldn't," Dawson said softly. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Only question now is whether you leave here on your horses or in the ground. Your choice." The tension stretched out, pulled tight as a wire. Clara could see Cole weighing it, calculating whether his pride was worth dying for. She could see the other killers shifting nervously, looking to their leader for guidance that wasn't coming. Finally, Cole's hand moved away from his gun. "Calloway's going to hear about this." "I'm counting on it," Dawson said. "You tell him that if he wants to do business in my county, he does it legal. No more ambushes, no more hired guns, no more threatening innocent people. And if I catch any of you within 50 miles of this cabin again, I'll arrest you for attempted murder. We clear?" Cole didn't answer, just turned and mounted his horse. His men followed, their faces dark with humiliation and rage. They rode out slowly, deliberately, making it clear this wasn't over, just postponed. When they were gone, swallowed by the darkness and distance, Dawson turned to Clara and Boone. His expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained sharp and assessing. "You two all right?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Beside her, Boone had sagged against the cabin wall, the knife slipping from his fingers. The effort of standing, of facing down 6 killers when he could barely walk, had cost him everything he had left. Dawson gestured to 2 of his men. "Get him inside. Carefully, those wounds look fresh." As they moved to help Boone, Dawson walked over to Clara, his voice dropping low. "That was a damn fool thing you did, stepping out alone to face them." "Didn't have much choice," Clara said. "There's always a choice. You could have let them take him. Could have saved yourself." Dawson studied her face. "Why didn't you?" Clara thought about all the easy answers she could give. Duty, morality, simple human decency. But the truth was simpler and harder than that. "Because someone had to," she said finally, "and there wasn't anyone else." Dawson was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Get inside. Get warm. My men and I will camp nearby tonight. Make sure Calloway's dogs don't double back. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next." Inside the cabin, Boone was back on the bed, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. One of Dawson's men, a younger fellow who introduced himself as Deputy Carson, was examining his wounds with surprising gentleness. "These are good stitches," Carson said, looking up at Clara. "You do this?" Clara nodded. "Probably saved his life. Infection hasn't set in yet, but it's close. He needs rest, real food, and someone watching him close for the next few days." Carson stood, wiping his hands. "I'll leave some medical supplies. You know how to change bandages?" "I'll figure it out," Clara said. After Carson left to help set up camp outside, Clara finally allowed herself to sit down. The adrenaline that had been keeping her upright drained away all at once, leaving her shaking and hollow. She'd faced down 6 killers. She'd stood her ground when any sane person would have run. She'd survived. But the cost was beginning to show itself in ways she couldn't quite process yet. "Clara," Boone's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "What you did out there was stupid," Clara finished for him. "I know." "No." Boone struggled to sit up, wincing. "It was the bravest thing I've ever seen. You could have died. Should have died, probably. But you stood there anyway, protecting a man you barely know, risking everything for what was right," Clara said quietly. "That's all. Nothing special about it." Everything about it was special. Boone's eyes were intense, burning with something that looked like anger but felt like respect. "Do you understand what you are, Clara Whitmore? You're not what this town says. You're not nothing. You're not weak. You're—" He stopped, his face twisting with pain, and Clara moved quickly to help him lie back down. But his hand caught hers, held it with surprising strength. "I meant what I said before," he told her. "When this is over, I'm making it right. All of it. The way they treat you, the way they've made you live. I'm going to burn it all down and build you something better. I swear it." Clara wanted to tell him not to make promises he couldn't keep. Wanted to tell him that people like her didn't get better lives, didn't get justice or revenge, or anything except more of the same grinding poverty and humiliation. But the look in his eyes stopped her. He believed it, actually believed that he could change things, could make the world answer for what it had done to her. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe it too. "Rest," she said instead, pulling her hand free. "We'll worry about the future when you're not bleeding." She spent the rest of the evening tending to Boone, changing his bandages with the supplies Carson had left, getting him to drink water and eat some of the stew she made from the provisions Dawson had given her. Outside, she could hear the sounds of Dawson's men setting up camp. Low voices, the crackle of fires, the occasional whinny of a horse. It should have felt reassuring, having that protection, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted. She'd crossed a line tonight, made herself visible in a way she'd spent years avoiding. Calloway knew about her now. His men had seen her face, heard her voice, watched her defy them. Even if Dawson kept them away for now, eventually they'd come back. Men like that always did. Around midnight, there was a soft knock on the door. Clara opened it to find Dawson standing there, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "Thought you might need this," he said. Clara took the offered cup, stepped aside to let him in. Dawson glanced at Boone, who was sleeping fitfully, then turned his attention back to Clara. "I need to know the whole story," he said quietly. "Not for legal reasons. I can already build a case against Calloway and his men for assault and attempted murder. But if I'm going to protect you both, I need to understand what I'm dealing with." So Clara told him. About finding Boone in the ravine, about the ambush, about saving him and hiding him and lying to Calloway's men. She told him about the starvation, the cold, the way the town had turned on her based on rumors and lies. She left nothing out, too tired to care about shame anymore. Dawson listened without interrupting, his face growing progressively harder as the story unfolded. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee like it held answers. "You know what you did amounts to obstruction of a murder," he finally said. "If Calloway had reported Boone's death officially, if there was a bounty or a warrant, you could be charged as an accessory." Clara felt her stomach drop. But there isn't," Dawson continued, "because Calloway's operating outside the law. The ambush was illegal, the hired killers are illegal, everything he's doing is illegal, which means everything you did was self-defense and citizen protection. Far as I'm concerned, you're a hero, not a criminal." The relief was so intense it made Clara dizzy. "What happens now?" "Now I take this to the territorial judge. Build a case against Calloway that'll hold up in court. Might take a few weeks, maybe a month, but we'll shut him down." Dawson paused. "In the meantime, you and Boone need to stay out of sight. My men will maintain a presence up here, keep Calloway's dogs at bay. But if you go into town, if you make yourself visible—" "I understand," Clara said. "Good." Dawson stood to leave, then stopped at the door. "One more thing. Those boys who've been harassing you, Tommy Brewster and his friends, I had a talk with them tonight. Explained that if I hear about them coming within 100 yards of you, they'll be spending some quality time in my jail. I don't think they'll bother you again." Clara blinked, surprised. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Dawson said firmly. "This town's been letting people get away with cruelty for too long. That ends now. On my watch, people get treated with basic human dignity, or they answer to me." He tipped his hat. "Get some rest, Miss Whitmore. You've earned it." After he left, Clara sat in the quiet cabin, listening to Boone breathe and the wind howl outside. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not quite hope. She wasn't ready for that yet. But something close. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, the world could be different than she'd always believed. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange kind of suspended time. Dawson's men maintained their camp near the cabin, rotating in shifts so there was always protection nearby. Boone grew stronger each day, his wounds healing clean and his strength returning. And Clara, for the first time in her adult life, had enough food, enough warmth, enough safety to breathe. But the peace couldn't last forever. On the 15th day, Dawson rode up to the cabin with news that turned Clara's fragile sense of security to ash. "Calloway's fighting back," he said without preamble. "He's got lawyers, powerful friends in the territorial government. They're claiming that Boone attacked his survey team first, that the ambush was self-defense. They're calling for Boone's arrest." Boone, who was sitting up now and could walk short distances without help, went very still. "That's a lie." "I know it is, but they've got signed statements from witnesses, probably paid off or threatened, and a judge in Denver who's willing to issue a warrant." Dawson's face was grim. "I can fight it, but it'll take time. And in the meantime, that warrant gives Calloway's men legal cover to come after you again." "How long?" Boone asked. "Week, maybe 2 before the warrant makes it here. But Calloway's already moving. My sources say he's hired more men, better men, ex-military, professional trackers. He's not taking chances this time." Clara felt cold dread settling in her stomach. "So what do we do?" "We?" Dawson looked at her sharply. "Miss Whitmore, this isn't your fight anymore. You've done more than enough. Way I see it, you helped a wounded man and got caught up in something bigger. No one expects you to—" "I'm not leaving him," Clara said flatly. "Clara," Boone started, but she cut him off. "I didn't save your life just to watch you get murdered by lawyers and hired guns. If they're coming, we face them together. That's final." Dawson and Boone exchanged a look, some kind of male communication that Clara couldn't decipher. Then Dawson sighed. "There might be another way," he said slowly. "But it's risky, and it involves you both leaving here, going somewhere Calloway can't reach you until I can build a solid enough case to clear Boone's name." "Where?" Boone asked. "I got a friend who runs a ranch about 200 miles north near the Wyoming border. Remote, defensible, and well outside Calloway's sphere of influence. You could hole up there for a month, maybe 2, while I work the legal angles here. Dawson paused. But you'd have to leave soon. Tonight, maybe tomorrow, before that warrant arrives and ties my hands. Clara looked at Boone, saw him calculating odds and options with the same sharp intelligence that had kept him alive this long. Then his eyes met hers, questioning. It's your choice, he said quietly. You've already sacrificed more than anyone should have to. If you want to stay here, reclaim your life, I'll understand. But if you come with me... He stopped, seemed to struggle for words. If you come with me, I can't promise it'll be safe. Can't promise it'll be easy. But I can promise you won't face it alone. Clara thought about her cabin, her life, the grinding poverty and loneliness that had defined her existence for so long. She thought about the town that had mocked her, the people who'd treated her like she was worthless, the endless cycle of survival that never got better. Then she thought about the past 2 weeks, about having enough to eat, about Dawson's respect, about the way Boone looked at her like she mattered, like she was someone worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth believing in. When do we leave? She asked. They left before dawn the next morning, riding out in the darkness with 2 of Dawson's men as escorts. Clara had packed what little she owned, a change of clothes, a few personal items, the medical supplies Carson had left. Everything else she left behind without a second thought. The cabin, the equipment, the life she'd built here. None of it mattered anymore. It had never really been hers anyway, just borrowed space in a world that didn't want her. Boone rode beside her, still weak but determined, his face set with the kind of stubborn will that had made him a legend. He'd tried one more time to convince her to stay, to let him go alone, but Clara had shut him down with a look. They were in this together now, for better or worse. The ride north was brutal. They stuck to back trails and high passes, avoiding main roads where Calloway's men might be watching. The weather turned against them on the second day, a late-season blizzard that reduced visibility to nothing and turned the trail into a death trap. They lost one of the escort horses to a hidden ravine, and Boone's wound started bleeding again from the strain of hard riding. But they kept going, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. On the 4th day, they reached the ranch, a sprawling operation nestled in a valley so remote it didn't even have a name on the maps. Dawson's friend, a grizzled old rancher named Wade Harrison, took one look at Clara and Boone and asked no questions. He just pointed them to a small cabin on the far edge of his property and told them to stay as long as they needed. Dawson vouches for you. That's enough for me, Wade said. Anyone comes looking, I don't know nothing. You keep your heads down and stay quiet. You'll be safe here. The cabin was small but solid, with a real stove and shutters that actually kept out the wind. Clara helped Boone inside, got him settled on the bed, and then just stood there in the middle of the room, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle onto her shoulders. They'd made it. They were alive. They were safe. But at what cost? Clara. Boone's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He was sitting up, watching her with those intense eyes. Come here. She crossed to the bed, sat down beside him. For a long moment, they were both quiet, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. I'm sorry, Boone said finally, for all of this, for putting you in danger, for taking you from your home, for... Don't, Clara interrupted. Don't apologize for being the only person in that whole damn valley who treated me like I was worth something. Boone reached out, took her hand. His grip was warm, solid, real. You saved my life. Now let me save yours. When this is over, when Dawson clears my name and Calloway's behind bars, I'm going to make sure you never have to live like you did before. No more poverty, no more humiliation, no more being invisible. How? Clara asked, because she couldn't help it. Because hope was terrifying, and she needed to know it was real before she let herself believe. Boone smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. I've got money saved, Clara. A lot of it. Years of guiding, scouting, bounty work. I never spent much because I never had anyone to spend it on. But now I do. He squeezed her hand. I'm going to buy you a house. A real house, with solid walls and windows that close and a stove that actually keeps you warm. I'm going to set you up with a business, whatever you want. A boarding house, a restaurant, a trading post. Something that's yours, that gives you independence and respect. Clara stared at him, afraid to believe. That's too much. You don't owe me. I owe you everything, Boone said fiercely. My life, my future, everything I've got left to give. And even if I didn't, even if this was just charity, which it's not, you'd still deserve it. You deserve a life where people see you for who you are, where they treat you with the dignity you've always had, but they were too blind to recognize. Tears burned at the corners of Clara's eyes, but she blinked them back. She'd cried enough in her life. Time to try something different. Okay, she whispered. Okay. They stayed at Wade's ranch for 3 weeks, hidden from the world while Dawson worked his legal magic back in the valley. News came sporadically, carried by riders who made the dangerous journey north with updates. Calloway's warrant had been issued but was tied up in appeals. The homesteaders were banding together, hiring their own lawyer. Public opinion was turning against Calloway as more details of his fraudulent claims came to light. But the best news came on a cold morning in late February, delivered by Dawson himself. He rode into the ranch looking exhausted but triumphant, and the first words out of his mouth were, "It's over." Clara and Boone both spoke at once. "What? Calloway's finished," Dawson said, dismounting. The territorial judge threw out his warrant, ruled that the homesteader claims are valid, and issued arrest warrants for Calloway and his hired guns for attempted murder, fraud, and about a dozen other charges. Cole and his men are already in custody. Calloway himself fled to Denver, but he won't get far. His whole operation's collapsed. Boone closed his eyes, the tension draining out of him. "It's really over?" "It's really over," Dawson confirmed. "You're cleared, Boone. Free to go wherever you want, do whatever you want. No one's hunting you anymore." Clara felt something break loose in her chest, relief so profound it was almost painful. They'd survived. Against impossible odds, against hired killers and corrupt power, and a system designed to crush people like them, they'd survived, and now they were free. Boone turned to Clara, and the look in his eyes was everything she'd never dared hope for. Respect, gratitude, and something deeper that neither of them had words for yet. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Clara thought about that word, home. It had always meant the cabin, the isolation, the endless grinding poverty. But maybe it could mean something different now. Maybe home could be wherever this strange, impossible journey led them next. "Yeah," she said, and meant it. "I'm ready." The ride back to the valley took 5 days, and with every mile closer to Timber Ridge, Clara felt the old familiar dread trying to claw its way back into her chest. She'd left that town as nothing, invisible, mocked, worthless in everyone's eyes. Now she was returning as the woman who'd defied Calloway's killers, who'd saved Silas Boone's life, who'd become part of a story that was already spreading through the territory like wildfire. She didn't know which terrified her more, being invisible or being seen. They crested the final ridge on a clear morning in early March, and Clara pulled her horse to a stop, looking down at the valley spread below. Timber Ridge sat in the center, small and insignificant from this distance. Smoke rising from chimneys, the main street cutting through like a scar. Beyond it, she could see her cabin, or what was left of it. Even from here, she could tell something was wrong. The roof had a different pitch, the walls looked straighter, and there was fresh lumber stacked beside it. "What?" Clara started, but Boone was already grinning. "Surprise," he said. "Dawson had some of his men make repairs while we were gone. Figured you deserved to come home to something better than what you left." Clara stared at the distant cabin, emotions warring in her chest. Gratitude, disbelief, and something dangerously close to hope. "He didn't have to do that." "No," Boone agreed, "but he wanted to. We all did." He nudged his horse forward. "Come on, there's more." They rode down into the valley with Dawson flanking them, and as they approached the outskirts of town, Clara noticed people stopping to watch. Men paused in their work, women stepped out of shops, children pointed and whispered. But the expressions on their faces weren't the ones Clara was used to. No mockery, no contempt. Instead, there was curiosity, uncertainty, and in some cases, what looked almost like shame. They rode straight down Main Street, and the silence that followed them was deafening. Clara kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, refusing to show the fear that was still there, still whispering that this was all temporary, that any moment now the world would remember who she really was and put her back in her place. Then someone started clapping. It was old Martin Fletcher, the carpenter, standing outside his workshop. Slow, deliberate applause that rang out in the quiet street. For a moment, no one else moved. Then his wife joined in, and then the baker, and then more people, until half the street was applauding as Clara rode past. She didn't know what to do with that. Didn't know how to process the sight of these same people who'd ignored her for years now acknowledging her existence, her actions, her worth. So she just nodded, kept riding, and tried to keep her hands from shaking on the reins. They stopped in front of the sheriff's office, and Dawson dismounted first. "Let's talk inside, away from the audience." The office was warm, the stove blazing, and Dawson poured coffee for all three of them before settling behind his desk. He looked tired but satisfied, like a man who'd won a hard fight and was ready to enjoy the victory. "First things first," he said, pulling out a stack of papers. "Calloway's assets have been seized by the territorial government. That includes his fraudulent mining claims, his equipment, and a significant amount of cash he kept in various banks. The homesteaders are getting their land back with clear titles. As for the money," he slid a document across to Boone, "there's a reward. Territory's paying $5,000 to the person who exposed Calloway's operation and helped bring him to justice. That's you, Boone." Boone picked up the paper, scanned it, then set it down without much interest. "I didn't do it for money." "I know, but it's yours anyway." Dawson turned to Clara. "There's also a fund that's been set up. Donations from the homesteaders, from people in town who wanted to show their appreciation for what you did. It's not much, about $300, but it's yours if you want it." Clara's throat tightened. $300 was more money than she'd ever had at one time in her entire life. "I didn't do anything worth—" "You saved a man's life," Dawson interrupted firmly. "You stood up to killers when no one else would. You risked everything for what was right. That's worth more than money can measure, but people wanted to give you something anyway. Don't refuse it out of pride, Clara. You've earned it." Clara nodded slowly, not trusting her voice. Beside her, Boone was quiet, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried an edge of steel that Clara had learned meant he'd made a decision, and nothing would change his mind. "I want to make a formal statement," Boone said, "about what happened, about Clara's role in it. I want it on record that she saved my life, that she protected me at great personal cost, and that without her courage and sacrifice, I wouldn't be here today." Dawson nodded. "I can arrange that, but Boone, people already know. The story's spread pretty far." "Let it spread farther," Boone said. "I want everyone in this territory to know exactly what kind of person Clara Whitmore is. And I want it coming from me, not secondhand gossip." Over the next hour, Boone gave his statement to Dawson, and Clara listened to him describe everything that had happened from his perspective. Hearing her own actions recounted in his words was strange and uncomfortable. He made her sound brave, heroic, when all she'd felt was terrified and desperate. But he was relentless, detailing every sacrifice she'd made, every risk she'd taken, painting a picture of someone Clara barely recognized. When he was done, Dawson set down his pen and looked at Clara with something like wonder. "You know, in 20 years of law enforcement, I've seen a lot of people do a lot of things. But what you did, that takes a special kind of courage, the kind most people don't have." Clara shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what needed doing." "That's what makes it special," Dawson said. He stood, gathered the papers. "I'll have this filed with the territorial office by end of week. It'll be public record. Anyone who wants to know the truth about what happened will have it straight from Boone himself." As they left the office, Clara noticed more people watching from doorways and windows, but the energy had shifted. Where before there had been curiosity and uncertainty, now there was something else. Acknowledgement, maybe, or the beginning of respect. It made her skin prickle with discomfort, but she forced herself to meet their eyes, to hold her head high. They rode out to Clara's cabin, and as they drew closer, she could see the full extent of the repairs. The roof had been completely rebuilt with new shingles, the gaps in the walls sealed with proper chinking, and someone had installed real glass windows that actually closed. There was a neat stack of firewood beside the door, enough to last months, and the small lean-to that served as a stable had been reinforced and expanded. Clara dismounted slowly, walking around the cabin in a daze. This wasn't the half-collapsed shack she'd left behind. This was a real home, solid and weatherproof and permanent in a way her old cabin had never been. Dawson's men did the big repairs, Boone said, coming up beside her. But there's more. Look inside. Clara pushed open the door and stopped dead. The interior had been transformed. The dirt floor was gone, replaced with rough wooden planks. The stove had been cleaned and repaired, and someone had built proper shelving along one wall. There was a real bed frame now, with a thick mattress and quilts. A table and 2 chairs sat near the stove, and on the shelves were supplies: flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar, dried fruit, tinned goods. Enough food to last through the rest of winter and into spring. But it was the coat hanging on the wall that broke her. A new coat, thick wool with fur lining, clearly made for someone her size. Not an afterthought or a hand-me-down, but something crafted specifically for her. Clara reached out and touched it with shaking fingers, and something inside her that had been locked tight for years finally cracked open. The tears came before she could stop them, hot and fast, and she pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle the sound. Boone's hand settled gently on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said quietly. "You're allowed to cry." "I don't—" Clara's voice broke. "I don't know how to— This is too much. I can't—" "Yes, you can." Boone turned her to face him, his hands firm on her shoulders. "You can accept help. You can accept kindness. You can let people give back some of what you've given. You've spent your whole life believing you don't deserve these things, but that's a lie, Clara. A lie this town taught you, and it's time to stop believing it." Clara looked up at him through her tears. This man she'd saved, this legend who'd become something more complicated and real than any story could capture. "I don't know how to stop." "Then let me help you learn." Boone's voice was gentle but absolute. "Starting now, starting with this. You deserve every bit of this. The cabin, the supplies, the coat. You deserve a home that doesn't leak, food that doesn't run out, and warmth that doesn't fail. You deserve to be seen and valued and treated like you matter. Because you do matter, Clara. You always have." The words settled into Clara like seeds in fertile ground, and she knew they would take time to grow, to become something she could truly believe. But for the first time, she thought maybe, just maybe, they could. She wiped her eyes, took a shaky breath, and nodded. "Okay. Good." Boone stepped back, giving her space. "Now, there's one more thing, something I need to do, but I want your permission first." Clara frowned. "What?" "I'm going into town tomorrow," Boone said, "to have a conversation with some people about how they've treated you, about the boys who harassed you, the merchants who cheated you, everyone who made your life harder than it needed to be. I'm going to make it very clear that kind of behavior isn't acceptable anymore." "Boone, you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to. I want to." His jaw set in that stubborn line she recognized. "But I won't do it if you don't want me to. This is your life, your town, your choice. So I'm asking, do I have your permission to stand up for you the way you stood up for me?" Clara thought about it, about Tommy Brewster and his mockery, about Pritchard and his cheating, about Mrs. Garrison and her casual cruelty, about all the small and large humiliations she'd endured for years because she'd been alone and powerless and nobody cared. But she wasn't alone anymore, and she wasn't powerless. "Yes," she said, "you have my permission." Boone rode into Timber Ridge the next morning with purpose written in every line of his body, and Clara rode with him. She'd thought about staying behind, letting him handle it alone, but something had shifted in her overnight. She'd spent her whole life hiding from confrontation, from attention, from anything that might make her more visible to the people who hurt her. But visibility was a weapon now, not a vulnerability. Let them see her. Let them remember who she was and what she'd done. Their first stop was Pritchard's General Store. The owner was behind the counter when they walked in, and his face went carefully blank when he saw them, the studied neutrality of a man who knew he was in trouble but wasn't sure how much yet. "Boone," Pritchard said, forcing a smile. "Heard you were back in town. Glad to see you recovered from your troubles." "No thanks to you," Boone said flatly. He walked to the counter, placed both hands on it, and leaned in. "I understand you've been cheating Miss Whitmore here, overcharging her for goods, refusing her fair credit, claiming she owes you money for work she already completed. Pritchard's face flushed. Now, that's not exactly... Yes or no, Pritchard? Have you been cheating her? The silence stretched out. Pritchard's eyes darted to Clara, then back to Boone, calculating. Finally, his shoulders slumped. Business has been tough. I needed to make up shortfalls somewhere. So you chose to steal from the poorest person in town, the one who couldn't fight back. Boone's voice was cold as winter steel. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to calculate every dollar you overcharged Clara over the past 4 years. Every penny you stole by claiming work as credit when it was actually payment, and you're going to pay her back in full. 4 years? I can't possibly remember. Then estimate high. Because if I find out you shortchanged her, I'm coming back, and next time I won't be asking nicely. Boone straightened. You've got 1 week to get me that number and the money. Understood? Pritchard looked like he wanted to argue, to make excuses, to explain why it wasn't really his fault. But something in Boone's expression stopped him. He nodded tightly. Understood. Good. Boone turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. From now on, Clara gets the same prices and the same treatment as anyone else in this town. If I hear otherwise, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are. We clear? Crystal, Pritchard said, his voice barely above a whisper. Outside, Clara felt like she was floating. She'd just watched Silas Boone, the Silas Boone, intimidate a man into paying back money he'd stolen from her. It felt surreal, impossible, like something that happened to other people in stories, not to her. Where to next? She asked. Mrs. Garrison's boarding house, Boone said grimly. Time to have a conversation about that room she took from you. Mrs. Garrison was in her sitting room when they arrived, entertaining 2 other women from town over tea. Her expression went from pleasant to alarmed when she saw Boone and Clara in her doorway. Mr. Boone, she said, setting down her teacup carefully. What a surprise. I need a word, Boone said. Private. The other women took the hint and left quickly, casting curious glances over their shoulders. When they were gone, Mrs. Garrison folded her hands in her lap and waited, her face composed but her eyes wary. I understand you evicted Clara from the storage room she was using, Boone said without preamble, based on rumors and innuendo about her character. I run a respectable establishment, Mrs. Garrison said stiffly. I can't have... Can't have what? A woman who saved a man's life and risked everything to do what was right? Boone's voice was sharp. Let me tell you what you can't have, Mrs. Garrison. You can't have it both ways. You can't profit from Clara's labor washing your linens and then turn around and slander her reputation when it suits you. You can't claim respectability while treating people with cruelty and contempt. Mrs. Garrison's face went pale. I never intended to be cruel. I simply... You intended exactly what you did, Boone interrupted. You saw an opportunity to hurt someone who couldn't fight back, and you took it. Just like you've been taking advantage of Clara for years, paying her less than anyone else, giving her the hardest jobs, treating her like she was disposable. That's not... I wouldn't... Yes, you would. You did. Boone stepped closer, and Mrs. Garrison actually flinched. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give Clara back that room, rent-free for the next year as compensation for wrongful eviction. And you're going to apologize to her, publicly, for damaging her reputation with your gossip. Mr. Boone, I can't possibly afford to... You'll afford it, Boone said flatly. Because if you don't, I'll make sure every person in this valley knows how you treated the woman who saved my life. I'll tell them about your exploitation, your cruelty, your hypocrisy, and we'll see how many guests want to stay at a boarding house run by someone with that kind of reputation. Mrs. Garrison looked at Clara, her expression a mixture of resentment and fear. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then she nodded stiffly. Fine. She can have the room back. And the apology? Mrs. Garrison's jaw tightened, but she turned to Clara and said, voice clipped, I apologize for any misunderstanding regarding your character. It was wrong of me to spread rumors without facts. It wasn't much of an apology, barely sincere, grudging at best, but Clara could see the humiliation in the older woman's eyes. The burning shame of being forced to acknowledge someone she'd always considered beneath her. That was worth more than any words. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, and meant it. They left Mrs. Garrison sitting rigid in her chair, her perfect composure finally cracked, and walked back out into the street. Clara felt strange, untethered, like the rules of her world had fundamentally changed, and she was still learning to navigate the new landscape. "One more stop," Boone said, "the important one." The blacksmith shop was at the end of Main Street, a large building with the forge blazing hot even in the cool spring air. Thomas Brewster, the smith, was hammering at an anvil when they walked in. He looked up, saw Boone, and his expression went guarded. "Boone," he acknowledged with a nod. "What can I do for you?" "Your son," Boone said. "Tommy. He's been harassing Miss Whitmore, riding out to her cabin with his friends, making crude comments, generally being a menace." Brewster set down his hammer with a heavy clang. "Boys will be boys, Boone. They don't mean anything by—" "They mean exactly what they say," Boone interrupted. "And your son means more than most. He's a bully and a coward, and he learned it somewhere. I'm guessing from watching how the adults in this town treat people they think are beneath them." Brewster's face darkened. "Watch yourself, Boone. That's my son you're talking about. And this is the woman who saved my life we're talking about," Boone shot back. "The woman your son called a whore and a pig. The woman he and his friends terrorized for their own entertainment while you did nothing to stop it." "I didn't know." "You knew," Boone said flatly. "Everyone knew. This whole town knew how Clara was being treated, and not one of you did a damn thing to help her. You just watched or joined in or pretended it wasn't your problem." Brewster was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to teach your son that there are consequences for cruelty. I want you to make sure he understands that what he did was wrong, and that it stops now. And I want you to think about the example you're setting, about the kind of man you're raising, and whether that's really who you want him to be." Brewster looked at Clara then, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. Shame, maybe, or recognition. "I'll talk to him," he said quietly. "Make sure it doesn't happen again." "See that you do," Boone said, "because if I hear about Tommy or any of his friends bothering Clara again, I won't be coming to you for a conversation. I'll be handling it myself. We clear?" "Clear," Brewster said. They left the forge and stood in the street, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. Clara felt exhausted, wrung out, but also strangely light, like she'd been carrying a weight for so long she'd forgotten it was there until it was gone. "Is it always going to be like this?" she asked. "You fighting my battles for me?" "No," Boone said, "because they're not going to be battles anymore. Today was about sending a message, making it clear that you're under my protection and anyone who messes with you answers to me. But that's temporary. What comes next, that's about giving you the tools and the standing to protect yourself." "What do you mean?" Boone looked at her, his expression serious. "I meant what I said before, Clara. About buying you a house, setting you up with a business. I've got the money, more than I know what to do with between my savings and that reward. And I want to invest it in you, in your future. But it has to be what you want, not what I think you should want. So tell me, if you could do anything, be anything, what would it be?" Clara had never been asked that question before. Her whole life had been about survival, about getting through each day with enough food and warmth to make it to the next. Dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford, fantasies that only hurt when reality crushed them. But standing here now, with Boone looking at her like her answer actually mattered, she let herself think about it, really think about it. "I want a place of my own," she said slowly. "Not just a cabin, but a real house. In town, where people can see me, where I can be part of the community instead of hiding on the edges. And I want—" She hesitated, the dream feeling too big, too impossible. "I want a restaurant. Nothing fancy, just a place where people can get good, honest food at fair prices, where travelers can stop and rest, where families can come for Sunday dinner, where everyone's welcome regardless of who they are or how much money they have." Boone's face split into a grin. "A restaurant, that's perfect." "It's expensive," Clara warned. "Building costs, supplies, hiring help. I've got enough," Boone assured her. "More than enough. We can start looking at properties tomorrow. Get an architect to draw up plans, have the whole thing built and ready by summer. Clara's heart was racing, caught between terror and exhilaration. This is really happening? This is really happening, Boone confirmed. He held out his hand. Partners? Clara looked at his outstretched hand, at this offering of equality and respect and shared purpose. Then she took it, her grip firm and sure. Partners, she agreed. Over the next 2 months, Clara's life transformed in ways she still couldn't quite process. Boone purchased a plot of land right on Main Street, prime real estate that had been sitting empty for years, and hired a team of builders to construct a 2-story building with a restaurant on the ground floor and living quarters above. He paid for everything up front, in cash, and made it clear to everyone involved that this was Clara's establishment, that she was the owner and decision-maker, and that anyone who had a problem with that could find work elsewhere. Clara threw herself into the project with fierce determination, working alongside the builders, learning carpentry and plumbing, and all the practical skills she'd never had the chance to develop before. She designed the restaurant layout herself, choosing where the kitchen would go, how many tables, what kind of stove. Boone gave advice when she asked for it, but otherwise let her make the decisions, respecting her vision even when it differed from what he would have chosen. The town watched all of this with a mixture of fascination and uncertainty. Some people, like Dawson and a handful of others, were genuinely supportive, stopping by to offer encouragement and help where they could. Others watched with barely concealed resentment, uncomfortable with seeing Clara elevated from the bottom of the social hierarchy to a position of actual power and influence. But no one mocked her. No one called her names or made crude jokes about her size or her worth. The presence of Silas Boone made sure of that. He was a fixture at the construction site most days, his reputation and his obvious respect for Clara serving as a shield against the cruelty she'd endured for so long. Pritchard delivered the money he owed, nearly $200 once everything was calculated, and did it publicly, in front of witnesses, counting out each bill with visible reluctance. Clara took the money without comment, deposited it in the new bank account Boone had helped her set up, and added it to the growing fund that would stock her restaurant's pantry. Mrs. Garrison made her public apology at Sunday service, standing in front of the whole congregation to admit that she'd wronged Clara and damaged her reputation without cause. The words were stilted and clearly painful for her, but Clara accepted them with grace, understanding that public humiliation was its own kind of justice. And Tommy Brewster and his friends stayed far away from her, warned off by their fathers and by the very real threat of Boone's wrath if they caused any more trouble. By late April, the restaurant was finished. It was beautiful in a simple, honest way. Wooden floors, large windows that let in natural light, a kitchen with a proper stove and workspace, tables and chairs that were sturdy and well made. Upstairs, Clara's living quarters were spacious and comfortable, with a real bed and a sitting area and windows that overlooked Main Street. The day before the grand opening, Clara stood in the empty dining room with Boone, looking around at what they'd built together. She still couldn't quite believe it was real, that this place was hers, that her life had changed so completely in such a short time. "What are you going to call it?" Boone asked. Clara had been thinking about that for weeks, turning over different names, trying to find something that felt right. Finally, she'd settled on one that captured everything this place represented. "The Hearthstone," she said, "because everyone deserves a warm hearth and a place at the table." Boone smiled. "Perfect." The grand opening of the Hearthstone drew a crowd that surprised even Boone. Half the valley turned out, curious to see what Clara had created, drawn by the novelty of a woman owning and operating her own business. Clara had prepared for days, cooking until her arms ached, and when she opened the doors at noon, people flooded in. She served beef stew and fresh bread, roasted chicken and vegetables, apple pie and coffee. Simple food, honestly prepared, offered at prices anyone could afford. And as people ate, as they tasted the care and quality she'd put into every dish, the conversation started to shift. This wasn't charity or pity. This was excellent food served by a woman who knew her craft. Clara Whitmore wasn't just the woman who'd saved Silas Boone anymore. She was a businesswoman, a proprietor, someone who'd earned her place through skill and hard work. Dawson was there, raising his glass in a toast. "To Clara Whitmore and the Hearthstone, may it stand as a testament to courage, second chances, and damn fine cooking." The crowd cheered, and Clara felt her face burn with embarrassment and pride in equal measure. This was what respect felt like, what belonging felt like, what home felt like. As the evening wore on and the crowd finally began to thin, Boone pulled Clara aside. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "I'm leaving tomorrow." Clara's stomach dropped. "What? Where?" "Just for a few weeks. There's work out west, guiding a survey team through the Rockies. Good money, and I promised them months ago before any of this happened." He paused, studying her face. "But I'll be back. This is my home now too, Clara. You made it that way." "You don't have to come back for me," Clara said, even though the thought of him leaving made her chest tight. "You've done so much already, more than I ever could have asked for." "I'm not coming back for you," Boone said. "I'm coming back because of you, because you showed me what real courage looks like, what real strength is, because for the first time in my life, I found something worth staying in one place for." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, pressed it into her hands. "This is half the reward money, $5,000. I want you to have it." "Boone, no, I can't." "Yes, you can. Use it to keep the restaurant running, to hire staff, to build your savings so you're never dependent on anyone again. Use it to secure your future, Clara. You've earned it 1,000 times over." Clara looked down at the pouch, feeling the weight of it, the promise of security and independence it represented. Then she looked up at Boone, this man who'd become her partner, her protector, her friend. This man who'd seen her worth when no one else did. "Come back safe," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "Always do," Boone promised. Then he did something unexpected. He pulled her into a hug, quick and fierce, and whispered in her ear, "You're going to change this whole valley, Clara Whitmore. You already have." Then he was gone, riding out at dawn with his pack and his rifle, leaving Clara standing in the doorway of the hearthstone, watching until he disappeared over the ridge. And Clara went back inside, back to work, back to the life she was building, one meal, one customer, one day at a time, because Silas Boone had given her something more valuable than money or property or protection. He'd given her the chance to become who she was always meant to be, and she wasn't going to waste it. The first week without Boone was harder than Clara expected, not because she couldn't manage the hearthstone. She could, and did, with a competence that surprised even her, but because his absence made her realize how much she'd come to rely on his presence, his steady confidence, his unwavering belief that she deserved every good thing coming her way. But she kept working. Every morning she rose before dawn to start the ovens, to prepare the day's bread and stews and roasts. By the time she opened the doors at 6, the smell of fresh baking filled Main Street, drawing in miners heading to their claims, ranchers stopping for breakfast before the long ride home, families who'd discovered that eating at the hearthstone was cheaper and better than cooking at home. Clara hired 2 women to help, Sarah Fletcher, Martin the carpenter's daughter, who needed work after her husband died in a mining accident, and an older widow named Ruth, who'd been doing laundry like Clara once had. She paid them fair wages, gave them respect, and in return got loyalty and hard work that made the restaurant run smoothly even during the busiest rushes. Within 2 weeks, the hearthstone had become the heart of Timber Ridge's daily life. People came not just for the food, but for the atmosphere Clara had created. Warm, welcoming, a place where everyone was treated the same, whether they were wealthy ranchers or struggling homesteaders. Clara enforced that equality with quiet firmness, making it clear that anyone who caused trouble or treated others poorly would be asked to leave and not return. Only once did she have to prove she meant it. A mining supervisor from one of Calloway's old claims, a man who'd somehow avoided arrest when the others were rounded up, came in drunk one afternoon and started making crude comments to Sarah. Clara walked over, put herself between the man and her employee, and said in a voice that carried across the whole dining room, "You need to leave now." The man sneered. "Or what? You gonna make me, fat girl?" The room went silent. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned to watch what would happen next. Clara felt the old familiar shame trying to rise up, the instinct to shrink back, to apologize, to make herself small and invisible. But then she remembered. She wasn't that person anymore. She'd faced down killers. She'd saved a legend's life. She'd built something real and valuable with her own hands. She was done shrinking. "No," Clara said calmly. Sheriff Dawson's going to make you. He's sitting right over there. She gestured to the corner table where Dawson was eating lunch, already rising to his feet with his hand on his gun. But before he arrests you for public drunkenness and harassment, I want everyone here to know that you're banned from the Hearthstone for life. You're not welcome in my establishment. Not today, not ever. The man looked around at the crowd of hostile faces, at Dawson approaching with deliberate steps, and whatever bravado he'd had crumbled. He stumbled out without another word, and the room erupted in approving murmurs. Dawson caught Clara's eye and nodded, respect between equals, then went back to his lunch. Sarah squeezed Clara's hand in silent thanks, and Clara felt something settle deep in her bones. The knowledge that she could protect herself and the people who depended on her, that she had real power now, earned through courage and consistency. After that, no one tested her again. The letters from Boone started arriving in the third week. Short notes at first, sent from various postal stations along his route, describing the mountains he was crossing, the people he was guiding, the strange beauty of the high country in spring. But beneath the surface descriptions, Clara could read something else. Loneliness, maybe, or the realization that he'd found something in Timber Ridge worth coming back to. She wrote back, her letters equally brief but honest. She told him about the restaurant's success, about hiring Sarah and Ruth, about the drunk she'd thrown out, and Dawson's approval. She told him about the small changes happening in town, how people were starting to greet her on the street, how some of the women who'd ignored her for years were now asking for her recipes, how even Pritchard had started being civil when she came in for supplies. What she didn't tell him was how much she missed him. That felt too vulnerable, too much like admitting she'd become dependent on someone again. She'd spent too many years learning to survive alone to give that up easily. But the truth was there in every letter she didn't send, every draft she crumpled up and threw away because it revealed too much. The truth was that Silas Boone had become more than her partner or her protector. He'd become the first person in her entire life who'd made her believe she deserved to be loved. In early May, a well-dressed man rode into Timber Ridge and asked for directions to the Hearthstone. Clara was in the kitchen when Sarah came back looking flustered. "There's a gentleman here to see you," Sarah said. "Says his name is William Foster, and he's a lawyer from Denver." Clara's stomach tightened with old instinctive fear. Lawyers meant trouble, meant people trying to take things away. But she wiped her hands on her apron, squared her shoulders, and went out to meet him. Foster was a small, neat man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and a briefcase. He stood when Clara approached, extending his hand with the kind of automatic courtesy that suggested genuine respect rather than performance. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "thank you for seeing me. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I have some business to discuss that I think you'll find quite interesting." Clara shook his hand warily. "What kind of business?" "The kind involving Calloway's seized assets." Foster opened his briefcase, pulled out several documents. "As you may know, when Calloway fled to Denver, the territorial government seized all his property and holdings. That included his fraudulent mining claims, his equipment, and several properties he owned in the valley. The government has been working to liquidate these assets and distribute the proceeds to his victims, the homesteaders he tried to displace, the workers he cheated, and so on." "What does that have to do with me?" Clara asked. Foster smiled. "Mr. Boone submitted a claim on your behalf. He documented everything you lost as a result of Calloway's actions, the income you couldn't earn because you were hiding him, the supplies you gave up, the risks you took. He also included testimony about how Calloway's men threatened you, attempted to enter your property illegally, and would have killed you if Sheriff Dawson hadn't intervened." Clara's heart was beating fast now. "I didn't ask him to—" "No, but he did it anyway. And the territorial judge agreed that you're entitled to compensation." Foster slid a document across the table. "The government is awarding you $5,000 from Calloway's liquidated assets. Additionally, there's this." He produced another document, this one with an official seal. Clara stared at it, trying to make sense of the legal language. "It's a land deed," Foster explained. "Calloway owned a ranch about 20 miles north of here, 200 acres of prime grazing land with a house, barn, and creek access. The government is transferring ownership to you as additional compensation for what you endured." Clara's vision blurred. She sat down hard in the nearest chair, the documents clutched in her shaking hands. $5,000. 200 acres. A ranch. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would they give me this much? Because Mr. Boone made a very compelling case, Foster said gently. He argued that you were instrumental in bringing Calloway to justice, that your courage and sacrifice prevented a murder and exposed a criminal conspiracy that had corrupted half the valley. He argued that you deserved more than just financial compensation. You deserved justice, recognition, and the means to build a secure future. He did all that? He did, and he was quite persuasive. Foster closed his briefcase. The money will be deposited in your bank account within the week. The land deed is effective immediately. Congratulations, Miss Whitmore. You're now a woman of considerable means. After Foster left, Clara sat alone in the empty dining room, staring at the documents until the words blurred together. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, poor, invisible, convinced she was worthless because that's what the world had always told her. That woman would never have believed this was possible, would have assumed it was a trick, a mistake, something that would be taken away the moment she let herself believe it was real. But Clara wasn't that woman anymore. She'd been forged into something stronger in the fires of the past 6 months, tempered by danger and hardship and the radical act of believing she deserved better. She could accept this gift, these gifts, not as charity, but as earned compensation for everything she'd given up and survived. She could let herself have this. That evening, she closed the restaurant early and rode out to see the ranch. It took her 2 hours to reach it, following the directions Foster had provided, and when she crested the final ridge and saw the property spread out below, her breath caught. It was beautiful. The house was modest but well built, with a wide porch and stone chimney. The barn was solid, the fencing in good repair. The creek ran clear and fast through the property, lined with cottonwoods that rustled in the evening breeze. In the distance, she could see the mountains, purple and gold in the setting sun. This could be hers, all of it. A place to build something even bigger than the hearthstone, a place to create a real legacy. Clara dismounted and walked through the house, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The previous owners, Calloway's men, probably, had cleared out their belongings, but the structure was sound. With some work, some investment, this could become whatever she wanted it to be. A working ranch, a retreat, a home. She stood on the porch as the sun set, watching the light paint the valley in shades of fire and shadow, and made her decision. She would keep the hearthstone. It was important, both as a business and as a symbol of everything she'd overcome. But this ranch would be her future, the place where she could build something lasting and permanent. And she wanted to build it with Silas Boone. The realization hit her like a physical force, undeniable and terrifying and absolutely true. She loved him, loved his strength and his integrity, and the way he saw her, really saw her, when no one else ever had. Loved that he'd fought for her, stood up for her, given her the tools to fight for herself. Loved that he'd left her alone to build her own success, instead of hovering and controlling, trusting her competence even when she didn't quite trust it herself. She loved him. And when he came back, she was going to tell him. Boone returned to Timber Ridge on a warm June evening, riding into town just as the hearthstone was closing for the night. Clara was wiping down tables when she heard the commotion outside. Voices calling out, people greeting him, the sounds of a community welcoming home someone they valued. She walked to the door, her heart hammering, and saw him dismounting in the street. He looked thinner, more weathered, his clothes dusty from weeks on the trail. But when his eyes found hers across the distance, his whole face transformed with a smile that made her chest ache. "Clara," he said, crossing to her in long strides. She didn't let him finish. She stepped forward and hugged him, hard and fierce, not caring who was watching or what they thought. For a moment he was still with surprise, then his arms came around her, holding her just as tightly. "I missed you," she said into his shoulder. "I didn't think I would, but I did." "I missed you too," Boone said roughly. "Every damn day." They stood there in the street, holding each other while the town watched with unconcealed curiosity and approval. When they finally pulled apart, Clara saw tears in Boone's eyes. This tough, legendary frontiersman crying openly because he was home. "Come inside," Clara said, taking his hand. "We need to talk." She closed the restaurant, poured them both coffee, and told him everything. About Foster's visit, about the money and the land, about her plans for the ranch, about how she wanted to build a future that was bigger than just survival. That was about legacy and purpose and creating something good in a world that had too much hardship already. And then, because she'd learned that courage meant being honest even when it terrified you, she told him the most important thing. "I want to build that future with you," she said, "not as partners or friends or people who owe each other debts, but as—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "As people who choose each other, who want to be together, not because circumstances threw us together, but because we genuinely want the same things." Boone set down his coffee cup very carefully, his eyes never leaving her face. "Clara, are you saying—" "I'm saying I love you," Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. "I'm saying I want you in my life, not as my protector or my benefactor, but as my equal, my partner in everything, if you want that too." The silence that followed felt eternal. Clara watched emotions flicker across Boone's face: surprise, disbelief, hope, fear. She'd gambled everything on this moment, laid her heart bare in a way she'd never done before, and now all she could do was wait for his answer. Then Boone laughed, a sound of pure joy and relief, and reached across the table to take both her hands in his. "Clara Whitmore," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I have crossed mountains and deserts, faced down bears and outlaws and blizzards that should have killed me. I've survived things that would break most men, but nothing has ever terrified me as much as the thought of losing you." He stood, pulling her up with him, his hands gentle on her face. "I fell in love with you the moment you stepped out of that cabin to face 6 killers alone. I fell in love with your courage, your strength, your absolute refusal to let the world make you small. And I have spent every day since then trying to be worthy of what you gave me." "You don't have to earn," Clara started, but Boone shook his head. "Let me finish," he said. "I want to build that future with you. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're beside me. I want to work that ranch and watch you run your restaurant and grow old together in this valley that tried to break you but couldn't. I want everything with you, Clara. Marriage, partnership, a real life. If you'll have me." Clara's answer was to kiss him, her first real kiss, awkward and perfect and full of all the emotion she'd been holding back for months. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and grinning like fools, she saw the future stretching out before them, clear and bright and possible. "Yes," she said, "to all of it. Yes." They were married by Sheriff Dawson in a simple ceremony at the hearthstone on a bright July morning, with half the valley in attendance. Clara wore a new dress, deep blue, tailored to actually fit her instead of hanging like a sack, and Boone wore his best suit, looking uncomfortable and proud in equal measure. Sarah and Ruth served as witnesses, both crying openly. Martin Fletcher gave Clara away, his rough carpenter's hands gentle on her arm. Even Pritchard and Mrs. Garrison attended, their presence more about social obligation than genuine goodwill. But Clara didn't care. She'd stopped needing their approval months ago. The reception lasted until sunset, with food and music and dancing in the street. Clara watched it all with a sense of wonder that never quite faded. This community celebrating her, honoring her, treating her marriage as something joyful and important instead of a joke or an impossibility. When she and Boone finally escaped to the ranch as the stars came out, riding together on his horse with her arms around his waist, Clara felt something settle deep in her soul. This was what happiness felt like, what home felt like, what love felt like, and she'd earned every bit of it. Over the next year, they built the life they'd dreamed of. Boone managed the ranch, raising cattle and horses with a skill that came from decades of understanding the land and animals. Clara ran the hearthstone with Sarah and Ruth, expanding the menu and the hours, building a reputation that drew travelers from across the territory. Together, they transformed the ranch house into a real home, adding rooms, building a library where Clara could learn to read better with Boone's patient teaching, creating a space that was theirs in every sense of the word. And slowly, almost without noticing, they changed the valley itself. Other women, seeing Clara's success, started their own businesses. The culture of casual cruelty that had dominated Timber Ridge for so long began to fade, replaced by something closer to genuine community. People started looking out for each other, helping those who struggled instead of mocking them. building something better than what had been there before. It wasn't perfect. There were still people who resented Claire's rise, who whispered that she'd only succeeded because Boone had given her money, that she was nothing without him. But those voices grew quieter each year as Clara proved them wrong through sheer competence and consistency. And eventually, most of them gave up entirely, forced to acknowledge that Clara Whitmore Boone was a force in her own right. On a cold December evening 2 years after their wedding, Clara stood on the ranch porch watching snow fall over the valley. Behind her, the house was warm and bright with lamplight, the smell of dinner cooking filling the air. In the distance, she could see the lights of Timber Ridge twinkling in the darkness. Boone came out to join her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders and pulling her back against his chest. They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the snow transform the landscape into something clean and new. "Do you ever think about that night?" Clara asked quietly. "When I found you in the ravine." "Every day," Boone said. "I think about how close I came to dying, how if you'd made a different choice, if you'd kept walking, none of this would exist." "Sometimes I can't believe I did it," Clara admitted. "It was so stupid, so reckless. I should have died pulling you out of there." "But you didn't," Boone said. "You survived because you're stronger than you ever gave yourself credit for. And you saved both of us, me from bleeding out in the snow, and you from a life that was killing you just as surely." Clara turned in his arms, looking up at his face, older now, marked by weather and time, but still the same man who'd opened his eyes in her cabin and seen her worth when no one else did. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for believing in me, for fighting for me, for loving me." "Thank you," Boone countered, "for being brave enough to save a stranger, for being stubborn enough to survive everything that followed, for being strong enough to build the life you deserved instead of accepting the one the world tried to give you." He kissed her then, soft and lingering, and Clara felt the old scars in her heart finally finish healing. She'd spent so many years believing she was worthless, believing that her size and her poverty and her loneliness were evidence that she didn't deserve better. But standing here now, in the home she'd built with the man she loved, with a successful business and genuine respect and a future that stretched out bright and unlimited, she finally understood the truth. She had always deserved better, always been worth saving, worth fighting for, worth believing in. The world had been wrong about her, and she'd proven it by refusing to accept their verdict as final. One choice on a winter trail had changed everything, not just for her, but for Boone, for the valley, for everyone who'd watched her transformation and learned that people could rise above their circumstances if given half a chance and the courage to seize it. Clara Whitmore had been invisible once, poor and mocked and treated like she didn't matter. But Clara Whitmore Boone was seen, respected, valued, loved, and that made all the difference. Inside the house, the timer chimed for dinner. Boone laughed and offered Clara his arm, and together they walked back into the warmth and light, into the life they'd built from nothing but courage and hope, and the radical belief that people deserved dignity regardless of who the world said they were. The snow kept falling, soft and silent, covering the valley in white. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the mountains, it would shine on a landscape transformed, not by the snow, but by the choices people made, the courage they showed, and the futures they built when they refused to accept that suffering was all they deserved. Clara had learned that lesson the hard way, dragging a dying man through miles of darkness, risking everything for what was right. And in return, she'd gained everything: a home, a partner, a purpose, and the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly who she was meant to be. In the end, that was worth more than all the wealth and respect and success combined, because no one could take it away from her now. Not the cruelty of strangers, not the weight of poverty, not the voices that said she wasn't enough. She was enough. She always had been. And finally, after a lifetime of doubt, Clara believed it.